Good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce Steve Roden. I was very happy, actually, that Anthony would ask me to do this, and to think that Steve might be the concluding voice in our lecture series for fall is a nice way to ring off. I first met Steve in 2004 when he spoke about his work at the University of Chicago. I've not gotten that talk out of my head, so I'm really happy to have it replayed and updated this evening. So 4 years later, and I think very nearly to the day, we have his presence here, and I'm happy that his work life, which has been complicated and busy, and our lecture calendar have finally aligned. And I think probably we could map that, Steve. Los Angeles Times critic David Pagel has written, quote, "As a culture, we are far more familiar with things getting lost in translation than discovered there. We accept that nuance and meaning fall between the cracks when translated from one language or system to another. As an artist who makes paintings, sculptures, drawings, videos, and audio installations, Steve Roden begins with the opposite assumption, that translation is a wellspring of creativity." Holly Myers, also a contributor to the Times, adds to this, quote, "Roden's work feels like the product of someone who thinks and looks and reads and listens and thinks some more and looks again and keeps looking. It is inquisitive, attentive, responsive." Steve Roden received his BFA degree from Otis Parsons in LA in 1986 and the MFA from Art Center College of Design in Pasadena in 1989. He has been exhibiting nationally and internationally in solo exhibitions and performances since the mid-1980s. His work has been included in exhibitions at the Pompidou Center in Paris, San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art, the UCLA Hammer Museum, Sculpture Center New York, the Drawing Room in London, among many, many others. He has toured performance work in Europe and in Brazil and Japan. Roden's projects have received funding, including the Nimoy Artist in Residence Grant, the COLA Grant from the City of Los Angeles, grants from the California Arts Council and from the City of Pasadena, the Subito Grant from the American Composers Forum, and the Durfee Foundation. An extensive discography, as well as images, interviews, exhibitions and performance record, his own essays, and selected critical bibliography can be found on his excellent website, inbetweennoise.com, and that's where we are. Thank you. Steve Roden.
Thank you. I'm glad I didn't trip over that. I thought I'd run this before I started, because I gave a talk a couple of months ago, and I felt like there's only one way that I feel comfortable talking about the work, and that way doesn't include most of what you're seeing here, which is totally important, which is part of the sort of archive of images that I come across, and they find their way into the work or into my mind, and also I have a blog where I post most of this stuff. And I thought it would be good to see it, to kind of have it wash over you a little bit before you see the work, because I think you'll see so much of this in the work. And so let me try and get out of this. And the computer's not toy, my friend. And so, well, my mom moved recently, and I found two great things in the garage. This is a drawing that I did, I think, in 4th grade. It was a happier time than it looks, but I think what's interesting is I totally remember this assignment and the fight that I had with the teacher about the sky, which is this whole sort of this area in here, because it was a watercolor project, and he told me if I left the watercolor like this, technique-wise, that I would get a C, but if I fixed it, I would get an A. And I took the C, which I think is telling when you see, I think my discomfort with the idea of technique in a lot of ways. This felt more honest. I mean, obviously when I was however old you are in 4th grade, I didn't understand that, but it gave me kind of permission, I think, in a lot of ways. And it's a lot more, it felt a lot more important finding it than I certainly thought it would, because it's a pretty dopey picture. Especially this weird dolphin shape with little Nikes on it and a little like dragster motor on its back, which is pretty great. So, and I also found this, which is I think pretty hilarious. This is from 1979 or 1980. This is the loudest moment in my life, by far. And I think too, this like sort of, in a lot of ways, is like a moment of permission again to do something that I have absolutely no skill, technique, or talent, and to approach it in a way that is completely immersive. It was a totally wonderful time. And when I got to art school and didn't know how to paint and didn't really learn how to paint in 6 years of school, I feel like I found my own way in a way that was quite comfortable. And so also I decided that I would try and read something, which is not necessarily my forte. I'm also going to turn this sound down a little bit. Because I think it also will give you some insight into the way I make things and the kind of thinking behind the things that I make in a way that's much different than how I'll sort of break these things down and explain them to you once I'm through reading this. So bear with this, it's only 3 pages. And this is text that came from my blog, which is a weird thing I think to mention, that I even do it, but it's become a big part of a kind of daily thinking. So this starts with this photo, which I found at the flea market, which is sort of my home away from home. Looking at a pile of old photos at the flea market Sunday morning, I was instantly smitten with this image. Its visual appeal is probably clear to most people who know my work. And as I scanned it into the computer, I realized that almost all of my work is somehow composed of building blocks like this image, small units that can move from one language to another, and the forms of these small trains and crooked lines on a table feel uncomfortably familiar, as if somewhere I've already made this painting. I actually counted the trains in each line, hoping the lines would reveal a secret, perhaps each one signifying a letter of the alphabet based on the number of units, and the whole becoming a visual translation of a word or phrase. Unfortunately, the long rows spelled g-g-g-g, and the short cluster at the top dab-a-bab. So I stepped away from myself and the limitations of my own ability to translate these forms into something else, and I fall back into the arrangement of units and the beauty of misunderstandings. I was slightly disappointed when I discovered these were trains, as I had hoped originally they were blocks of wood, or some such secret aesthetic activity, which they still of course could be, for who hasn't absent-mindedly arranged books by color or counted steps out loud while climbing? It led me to one of my favorite painters and one of the masters of large structures built from single box-like units, and also toward objects that revel in their stubbornness in not letting their secrets be known. You have to take them on their own terms and allow their beauty to simply envelop you, and that would be Jensen. I was talking to someone on the phone a few days ago about how Alfred Jensen's paintings come down to this kind of powerful vibrational moment, where logic and understanding is rendered meaningless by emotion and experience. In the end, there is no need to seek answers from the mass of specifically arranged units as much as to accept their potential for serious wandering. Perhaps that's what Jensen meant by painting remote sensing across the top of this painting, as its force can seep deeply inside of a sensitive viewer from across the room. I think most visual objects have the potential to affect us in this way, deeper and quieter than the logic of words, and I hold a kind of secret hope that Jensen wouldn't mind me loving his work for all the wrong reasons. And so that was in February of 2007. And in June of 2008, we get to this. I've been thinking a lot about how certain images remain in your subconscious mind and kind of work on you over time unknowingly. The one thing blogging has done for me is that there is an automatic record of the date of discovery for every image that I find and post. I don't go back and look at older postings or images much. In fact, revisiting things on the computer almost never happens. I don't have the empty-minded flipping of pages experiences in this space as I do at the bulging books in my studio that are filled with cut-out findings and held in place with tape. Opening the book is not so much a process of seeking as wandering through images that are familiar, but which I'm still struggling to understand why they attract me in the first place. These are the images I've gathered over a longer period of time and on a less consistent basis. With the blog, I simply roll towards certain things in a just awakened state in my room of books, old photographs, and various kinds of ephemera, where inspirational fodder for a morning gets posted and then replaced the next morning with something else. Last night I was finishing up a piece that I've been working on for 6 months or so. It will be part of a show that opens Saturday. During its making, things hover conversationally, moving through my mind, both conscious and unconscious as I build. Tramp art, molecule models, Bruno Taut's alpine architecture, Tirani's ideas towards the Danteum, the paintings of Kupka, Steiner's Goethanum, etc. These and other things I've already forgotten bubble in and out of the surface during the process of thinking and making. But as always, there are things that go into a work and end up very clearly in the results that I never really notice as an inspirational presence during the making. Last night I went into my studio to take a picture of all the parts of this sculpture lying on the floor, and it wasn't until I looked at the window on the back of my digital camera to take the picture that I saw the space of my studio as a flattened image, and I remembered the snapshot of the toy trains that I had posted a year and a half ago. I had posted it in relation to the paintings of Alfred Jensen, and strangely enough suggested then that the arrangement could be or might be a score. The interesting thing is not only that the train photo clearly had unconsciously suggested the structural form, but that I originally connected the train forms to images related to a painting, Jensen's. In my response to a photograph of what is essentially a sculptural work and connecting it to painting, and then having it unconsciously generate a sculpture, demonstrated a pretty clear relationship between the way I think about both paintings and sculpture, along with everything else. It is rare when a single image or a simple object can become a model of the connectedness of all things that one makes, as well as suggesting a connectedness among all things one responds to in the world. The train photo and the photo of these objects on my studio floor reveal to me a kind of intuitive focus, being able to work while both knowing and unknowing at the same time. And in some ways, the trains show me more about my work than my work itself, because it's difficult to see one's own work in light of such distance and clarity. The other interesting thing is that the train photo is taken at an odd angle where the images of things lying flat on a table are read as cascading in relation to pictorial space rather than actual gravity. When I started these piles of wood, I imagined they would be on the floor, a series of minor architectures for humble thoughts, but eventually decided to string them together, suggesting more of their internal musical and narrative structure. The piece is a translation of a 12-page classical music score, that's the final piece. But I wanted to allow them not only to suggest architecture, but also to construct architecture with them, and hence their hanging becomes a kind of architectural space. The final work will not reflect the train images as they were in life, but as they are in the reading of a photograph. Inspiration is a strange thing. An image or object tends to work hardest on me when I've seemingly forgotten all about it. Conscious replication is of little interest, as it tends to deny a source the ability to reveal the deeper truths beyond it. For me, it's about planting seeds and allowing them to have the freedom to grow without my directing them. One simply allows inspiration to be breathed in and waits until they find their way to the surface. The idea is to never really notice they've had their way with me until I finish a piece, and then the results tend to suggest it didn't exactly come from where I thought it did. When Benjamin wrote that ownership for book collectors is the most intimate relationship one can have with objects, not that they come alive in him, but it is he who lives in them, I think he is both right and wrong. For there are many things we do enter and live inside of, but there are also certain things that enter us, and while they are sometimes slumbering inside us unnoticed, there are times they do come alive. In many cases, we might not remember they are in us, while they are continually working their quiet magic in wonderfully mysterious ways. But once in a while, a moment like this decides to let you in on the secret, and one realizes that the artist is not always the guide as much as the guided. And so I think to start with that, you have a sense that I can really only talk about how I went about making these things. But there's all of this other stuff that's kind of behind them that I find difficult to articulate, and also they're built so much for one's experience with them and for having a kind of similar relationship to them that I have with the things that they come from, that in a way, like dissecting them in this way is difficult and not totally connected at all to the experience one would have with them. And so I painted, well, this was the first painting I really feel like I did. This is like 2 years out of grad school. And it's the first painting I did that I used a system to generate the structure and the image on the surface. And so for about 5 years I made paintings with letters. And I felt very afraid that I was becoming the guy who paints letters. And the whole reason for bringing these kind of systems or strategies into my work was to avoid this feeling like when I worked purely intuitively, I felt like I was just making the same painting over and over again. And to have a predetermined structure imposed upon it felt like the most uncomfortable thing I could do. But I felt these paintings, the systems were very straightforward, and they didn't, the relationship between myself and the information I was using just wasn't difficult enough. It didn't cause me enough problems. And so I stopped painting for a year. And I worked on a number of other projects, which were all incredibly important in terms of how my work evolved. This is a stencil set for drawing Hot Wheel cars from 1969. It's the earliest toy I remember having and the earliest memory I have of drawing. I had this when I was 5. I found it at the flea market and I went berserk. I was so excited, and I took it home to draw cars with it, and it was an incredibly boring experience. Yeah, it was quite depressing. But there's this, it's a really interesting system. You can combine these stencils to draw, I think, over 100 different cars. And so I decided to try and make these drawings using all of the parts of the cars, but not putting them in the right order, to see if I could make as many different drawings as the box said you could make different cars. And the idea was that it's kind of like sampling. I mean, I'm arranging someone else's lines in my own order, but the lines themselves aren't mine. And so the image is built from something that existed and was created by someone else. There's also, of course, I'm using the wrong tools, so there's stains and drips and marks that are also mine. But it was the first time I built something using someone else's parts in a way. And then I translated this book of poetry into English from Swedish without a dictionary or knowing any Swedish. But I did it, I tried to do it in a really sincere way. It wasn't, I knew the writing of this writer, and I really wanted this book to be in English, and I couldn't find it in English, and I found it in Swedish, and so I kind of know the landscape that his work exists in, even though I don't know the language, of course. And so I just used the way the words sounded or the way they looked. if I couldn't find an English equivalent, once in a while I could find a Spanish one, or I know a little bit of Japanese and a little bit of French. So sometimes I was really wandering. But it was. I'm not a writer, and it was a way to, again, allow something that was pre-existing to generate something else that was deeply connected to it. This piece was a piece of sculpture that involved 490 small forms based on a list of land formations on the moon around 1900. And in this I used the vowel structure of each name to generate the sculpture in terms of the number of vowels determined the height, and the specific vowels determined the materials. So like if this looks like it's 3 inches tall, and it had a U, which is pencil, and an I, which is wire, and maybe an E, or an O, which is gesso. Oh, you can totally ask questions anytime, yeah, because you can tell if I keep talking, you're going to fall asleep. So.
What was the title of the Swedish translation?
Well, the writer's Per Lagerkvist, and the book is called Vladen Dictor, which I translated as fallen spoken, because Vladen sounds like fallen, and dictor sounds like diction, so it became spoken. The whole thing was sort of done like that. And so, and then this other project, I took 26 different green colored pencils and assigned each one to a letter of the alphabet, and then started to translate this book by Hermann Hesse, page by page, letter by letter, making a mark in the corresponding color. And so all of these things kind of suggested ways in which I could interact with information and to allow the information to determine mostly a structural form beneath whatever it was I was still building intuitively, or determine the parts that I was arranging. I also had been working on sound for a long time, even during grad school, and even, well, since high school. But it took a while for me to feel like it was somehow connected to the rest of my work, that it wasn't music or, it's sort of like being in a band, which can still be related, but for me to have a presence within the context of my work, I took a long time to kind of understand the connection. And so most of the early work aesthetically was simply speakers, sound carriers, and with this very sort of rigid idea that if it's going to be about listening, there should be nothing to look at. There's no reason the sound doesn't need a visual, just like the paintings don't need soundtracks, obviously. And so I think like up to this point, there were all these different things going on. And then slowly over time, particularly in the last 5 years, a lot of these things are kind of colliding together so that there are sculptural pieces that have speakers hanging on them. There's films that are now not silent but have sound. And the sound and the film were kind of birthed from the same place but weren't made to be fitted together. But after that moment, I decided to come back to painting, and I basically took I took a ruler and for the first 26 inches wrote down the letters A to Z, and then used the ruler as a kind of translation tool to develop images through translating text using this ruler. So this is the phrase "the silent world" 10 times, this black form. And then this stuff is totally intuitive response to the form itself. And then I did this one, which was based on John Glenn's first transmission from space. And here the lines aren't measured, but it's the number of sort of jags in the same color. So A is 1 and B is 2 and C is 3. It's pretty basic. And then I did maybe 5 paintings like this, and I thought, this is going to be kind of tricky because one could be John Glenn, and one could be the Led Zeppelin song, and one could be the Declaration of Independence, and there'd be this sort of funny thing about what are they, as opposed to using the process as a vehicle to generate something that can be compelling on its own without it needing to have this sort of jokey, ironic distance in the background. And so I started over with this phrase, the silent world, making these very small paintings to try and kind of rid myself of everything that was fun. And to really start to think about how I build things. This is all way before I even found the train photo. And so it went slowly from A being a 1-inch line to A being 1 square, E being 5 squares instead of a 5-inch line. And then the vocabulary just kind of kept expanding. I jump ahead a little bit. So that in these, it's much more complicated. It's the number of sort of objects that are the same color. Here, the system shifts within the painting a number of different times, and even here, pretty much every mark that you see is somehow related to the phrase. But I didn't want them to be about decoding, and clearly at this point, there would be no way to decode them. And so this is the difficult part, is that the way the work evolves is, the paintings evolve on their own, the sound work evolves on its own, the film work evolves on its own. So there's no kind of complete standard trajectory that everything takes that makes it easy for me to talk about everything in a sort of easy timeline form. But this was a sort of monumental step with the sound work when this piece by Joseph Cornell gave me permission to start to allow the sound work to become visual. And basically I was just flipping through a book and saw this, and it gave me the idea of putting a speaker in a bottle, which didn't have much resonance, except that, actually that's a funny word to use, because what it did do was it gave the speaker, it was like these became speaker cabinets, and they gave the speaker a much greater frequency response. And so I felt like I was so afraid to just make an aesthetic decision that I felt like, okay, well, it's ethical because it's actually changing the sound of the speakers, and it's totally important. And this is a kind of dumb studio logic that you sort of have when you're by yourself too much. And so I did this piece, which is kind of unlike the way that I tend to work, which is that I used the sounds of the bottles done with mallets and violin bows, and made a piece and then had it playing back, and you were kind of looking at what you were hearing, and it fit together perfectly like this, which is something I don't ever want to aspire to. There were no holes at all. And so I went back to Cornell's piece, and I thought I should put the moon in the bottle instead of the bottles in the bottle. And so I had this recording of Yuri Gagarin's first transmission from space. And so I used that to generate this sound piece, which was 100 speakers and 100 bottles. And you as a viewer, you would have no idea that you were listening to the kind of the first sounds on Earth that were transmitted from someone in space. And the sound was not that different from what's playing here. And so that sort of it just sort of opened the door to a lot of possibilities where the conceptual parts at the beginning, the thing that sort of inspired the work, could generate two things together, one visual and one audio, that would have this strange relationship in form when they were exhibited, because they weren't really meant to be placed together, but they came from the same place, so they're getting kind of sandwiched together to create this kind of place that I feel like is totally unresolved, but is quite interesting as an experience. And so this is an experimental house that was built by inflating a large balloon. And I was interested in how the architect was essentially using air to create these forms. And so I created this piece using balloons. and the sound was made by blowing into old organ pipes. And so everything here was formed by my breath in a similar way that in this architecture, everything was formed with air. And I'm just going to go past a bunch of this stuff because you'll be here till tomorrow. And so the bottle piece ended up generating several. I think I used the bottles in the four different ways I could come up with. But here was related to this idea of something called the fulgurite, which is when lightning hits sand and forms a small piece of glass.
What was the name?
A fulgurite, which I don't know so much about, but that's all I know about it, actually. They're quite beautiful. I saw them in an auction catalog of like fossils and things, and they're really amazing. They look kind of like churros, if you know, but really small. They're totally incredible. But I had this violin that was my grandfather's that had been sitting in a closet for probably 40 years, and I got it because I'm the only person in my family who does anything remotely connected to music. And my aunt really wanted it for sentimental reasons, so I had to give it to her, which was wrong. And so I knew the tuning that I had it in, which was as found, was going to be gone, no matter whether or not I got it back. And so it felt connected to that idea to use this thing as this moment could be kind of recorded in form. Maybe I'll talk about this. This is a fairly uncharacteristic piece because it was really large scale and also involved technology, both of which I'm not a huge fan of. But I was invited to work with some scientists from Caltech to collaborate on a piece, and the only requirement was that I had to use earthquake data because none of the other scientists at Caltech were interested in working with me except the guy who worked with earthquake data, which was actually the one thing I didn't really want to work with. But we basically built this structure which was inspired for no reason other than this would not leave my brain, this lamp by Corbusier. And we basically took this earthquake data, which looks like this. It looks like that. And we basically made a low resolution image of it, which looks like this, where the variables would be 75 instead of God knows how many thousands are in this. And then we took these, which are color-coded the same as this, which made me happy and not the scientist. And we built the structure, and then on the roof of the structure were 75 of these machines. And so you could see each one as a washer and sort of almost like a chopstick and a fishing swivel, and radio-controlled car motors. And basically this machine would be reading this image, dumb it down to this image, and then play this composition across the structure, which then acted kind of like an acoustic guitar. And so this giant wooden structure resonated the sound. And it was beautiful. It sounded like, well, I think I have it. It sounded like, well, I won't tell you because you can hear it. But the nice thing was that the scientist came with his 4-year-old, and the scientist was really unhappy because it didn't shake and have low frequency and feel like it was sense around. But his kid loved it. You can hear at times it's hitting the wooden structure because the thing was definitely put together with my own aesthetic, which means it was a little bit wonky. So it was nice over time. It kind of fell out of sync with itself, and it was hitting the wrong things, and it got more percussive, and it had this beautiful sort of organic look. And I was asked to show it again, which I had, well, for a number of reasons, no interest in doing. Of course, one of them being the scientist, but there were a lot of things about this piece I wasn't happy with, even though it was such an incredible opportunity. One of them being the fact that these robots were moving in real time, and they broke, as anything technological tends to do. I mean, the reason I put them on the roof was that you wouldn't be able to see them, but people still were like trying to see them. They just became very distracting. So I got asked to show it again, and where is this? Here it is. And so I told the people that the piece was destroyed, which is true, and B, I didn't want to work with scientists again, and could I propose something myself that would kind of feel much more exciting to do 2 years later as something new. I noticed that this light isn't on, which means this isn't working. There we go. So I proposed this other piece that dealt with star names based on this list of the 50 important special star names. And I took these, I made this ruler, which then generated these forms based on the vowel structure of each of the names. And then I made these models from the forms, and then I gave them to an architect who was very unhappy because he had to do this with it, which was harder than making the piece, I think. And that generated this, which was quite strange and wonderful. And this piece, I think, really pushed that other piece to a whole other level where it wasn't about the source and it wasn't about the technology. It was about the experience with the object as a form and with the sound as a listening experience, which could only occur inside the form. And then these, well, this gets convoluted, but these are scores that I made for the sound that are using the same stars that are listed on the list. I don't have a picture of it, but these were used as scores, inserting them inside of old zithers, and so wherever the zither strings came across that matched the points where the stars were, those were the notes that were plucked. And I don't think I have that in here. Well, if you take this, right? Do you know like an auto harp? So if you take the auto harp, you lay it down, and you take this paper and you slide it under the strings, then wherever these little speaker shapes are, you'd pluck those strings where they correspond. Like here's the strings and here's the paper. And then I manipulated the sound, but the tonal relationships were based on this. I can't read or write or play music, so. Yeah, these are the stars, and then where in the star's name there are letters in the alphabet that correspond to A through G. those notes are notated, because one thing I do know is every good boy does fine in face. And which actually is perfect, because the project that I've been working on for the last 5 years is essentially based on this 12-page classical music score, which I have, using every good boy does fine in face, translated into letters, which each, I think this is a measure, right? So each measure generates a page like this, and then this becomes a score for generating a piece of work. And so, again, A is 1 and B is 2 and C is 3, but in these things it becomes, these are quite large for me. I mean, most of my paintings up until this work, this was a big painting. This was a normal painting. This is at least 2 or 3 times the size of the projected image, so it's about this big. Which, you know, for most painters is still not huge, but for me it's gigantic, epic. And so each one of these, as opposed to the Silent World paintings, each one of these has anywhere from 60 to 200 numbers that the score is built from. And the rule is always that if I get to the end of the score and I start over, no matter where I am with the painting, if I start over, I have to go through the whole note sequence again. So it's really about how this information influences the way I build and compose these things. And so I make sometimes, like you could see this curved piece of wood which starts here and goes down here, and that generated this, most of this form. So again, these, each one of these sort of areas is measured. And so for the first, I don't know, 10 measures maybe, it was exclusively generating paintings. And then it started to generate sculpture. Well, there's always a starting, like I don't start with a plain white canvas. I'll paint for maybe a week or so, mostly with washes, just so that I have something to respond to. And there's also moments where I'll leave, like here, like all of this. Well, part of this is failure. You know, the list of the score gets laid down. You know, anywhere from 5 on a really easy painting to 100 times, and so all those iterations are what gives it texture. When I start and I'm working intuitively, there's no textural development as an aesthetic thing. I'm just kind of working with washes so I have a color field to work on top of. A lot of drips and things. But as I go along, there are moments where I disengage from the score. As long as if I'm in the middle of it, I go back to it where I left off. And there'll be decisions like this black area, is just a form that came out of intuitive response to whatever else I was doing. But then it suggested, the form of this area, which the sequence of colors in this is all related to the notes. So in some cases, instead of measured things, it becomes a relationship of a specific color to a note. And then that can change after 10 minutes. I mean, so they're constantly shifting. But the information is still kind of determining what colors are next to each other. I mean, I did another talk like 2 weeks ago, and somebody asked me about my palette, and I couldn't answer a single question about it. I mean, I don't know much about mixing color, so it's just, well, I have my way, but they're not, I think about it like playing an instrument. My uncle's trained and he plays electric bass, and the minute he looks at the neck and places his finger on a note, he knows exactly what he's going to hear. when I take red and yellow and maybe some white and mush them around together, I have no sense of what color that's going to be. I know it'll be like a kind of orangey pinkish thing, but I'm not. I haven't spent enough time wanting to know how to make specific colors. So when if something gets dinged and I try and match it, you can always tell. I mean, I kind of feel like that's part of it. It's part of its life. So I mean, I could tell you for sure that that greenish brown at the bottom is probably, I mixed a group of 7 colors to correspond to the notes that are in there somewhere, and then I had leftover paint, and it made that mushy green. And I mean, there is a sense that that would somehow relate to the other colors because it's made of them. But if it was mushy red or mushy brown or mushy blue, I still would have used it there. I wasn't after a specific green. And I try and have those decisions be intuitive. I mean, as much as, again, this is the problem I have with talking about my work in this way, is that it sounds, I think, more aware than it is when I'm doing it. I'm not doing these things in the spirit of like early Soloist cube pieces where I know the amount of variables and I go out and make them. It's about pushing my intuitive decisions to a place that's unfamiliar, and that's been the biggest benefit of this, is they don't look like the paintings I necessarily want to make or thought I would make, or certainly not the paintings I knew I would make. And so it's, yeah, I mean, it's funny, I did this painting, this is maybe a year and a half old, and everyone that came into my studio said something about the color because it doesn't look like the color in the rest of the paintings. And again, it's like I started up here, I probably mixed these, and then I started, at least on this last level that this image was built on, and I just sort of, worked my way across, and it just sort of evolved. I don't know, I can't, I don't know how to articulate that any better than that. And so these are the most recent ones, which again was quite a big jump up in scale and intensity. And it's been strange not being someone who reads music and plays an instrument to spend almost 5 years working with the score and having it generate so many different kinds of things. Also these I used it also to generate new scores. And then also to generate drawings. Then there's this, which is very strange and beautiful. No, this was part of the show. Everything in the show except for this was generated from the score, and this is oh, it's such a long story. It's connected to the standard stoppages that Duchamp did with the string. But it's also connected to the Errata Musicale, which was a score he did for a piece of music where numbers were dropped into a hat and words were dropped into a hat and they were pulled out. And I originally made a sound piece related to that process, and then was going to make a sculpture related to that process. And so there are 25 variables in his piece, so I took 25 numbers 1 through 25 and dropped a piece of a foot-long piece of string onto 25-inch piece of string on 25 pieces of wood, and cut them out, and then put them in the order that came from pulling these numbers out of this hat. And it was just a terrible piece. It was totally, it didn't work. It sat on the floor of my studio. It was in a line that almost separated my studio like a diving board. And I refused to move it. I kept stepping over it. And one day I was so pissed, I just took it all and put it in a pile, the smallest piece to the largest. And it was perfect. Yeah. So, I don't know. I could talk some more about some more recent things. It's hard without being able to hear the sound to talk about these sound pieces. But this is a video piece I did earlier this year based on this recording that was discovered, which anyone interested in sound must have heard about. This recording that was basically a drawing done with the machine, like, I don't know, 20 years before the first cylinder discs were made, before Edison made sound reproducible. And basically with the same principle, it was a piece of paper with black soot on it, and it was on a roller of some sort with something that looked like a Victrola horn, and somebody sang into it, the guy's daughter, and it made a beautiful drawing of her voice. And his idea was that it would be a record of sound, the most beautiful thing I could imagine. And there wasn't an interest on his part or knowledge at that time that drawing could ever be played. But some scientists, I think in France, at least the drawing was in France, found it and used a computer to read it and to generate this recording, which is quite beautiful, and like 10 seconds long, of a young girl singing a French lullaby. And so I did this piece where I took 60mm film and I coated it with ink, and built a rectangle of 16mm film strips that was the size of this original drawing. And then I listened to her performance on headphones with my eyes closed and scratched with a needle onto these strips of film, a kind of redrawing of her sound. And then I projected that, and as these scratchy lines moved this way and that way, I tried to sing along with them, or hum along with them, where my pitch would vary right and left, so that her voice became a drawing, which then became a score for my singing, so I felt like I was then singing with her. And then it was projected onto this plaster disc that was cast from an old Edison record. And the lullaby was Clair de Lune, so it all kind of related to this form of the moon. And obviously, in the installation, the room was completely dark, but you couldn't get a good photo of it in that way. I might actually have a piece of that on here. Well, each strip was essentially the length of this drawing, and so each strip I coded a different color. I just rubbed ink on it so that it kind of related to photo emulsion. And yeah, this is. Let me. I think this should play. Did all the editing in iMovie too, so I'm quite proud of that. The interesting thing is I did this, all the recordings are just the first pass, so I didn't really have a sense of what I was doing. And the more I watched the piece, I forgot how long it is, not very long, maybe 3.5 minutes or something. There's this wonderful relationship between the movement of the lines and the voice, not because they're perfectly in sync, but because they're kind of following each other. The sense of the activity is still present, I think, in the result once you've seen it a few times. There are all these moments where the voice is lagging behind because I didn't know what the image was really going to look like. And sometimes I anticipated something happening that didn't happen and I hummed anyways. So yeah, all of the films that I've done in the last bit of time have been drawn on 16mm strips. And so maybe this will be the last thing I talk about. This is a map of Norway, of this region in Norway that I went to last year, which was the greatest thing I've ever been invited to do. And when they gave us this map, I didn't understand it, and I didn't understand where we were. I still don't understand where we were. But I know we were here somewhere. And we climbed glaciers and made recordings, crazy recordings, in glaciers and remote lakes. And we went to this island that nobody lives on, and it was incredible. And so I gathered all these recordings, and then I came home and was supposed to make a piece, an installation piece, a sound piece. And so I made a piece in 3 sections. In the first section, I traced all the water features on this map because I realized that the map was broken up into 16mm squares, which was totally beautiful. And so this is sort of the stills from that part. And then the second part, I traced every word in this chapter from this novel by a Norwegian writer this whole thing was supposed to be connected to Edvard Grieg for the 100th anniversary of his death. And so this was sort of the landscape that Grieg was inspired by. This piece was a writer who was good friends with Grieg, who I didn't know anything about, but who turns out is sort of like the Hemingway of Norway. And I brought this book with me I found from, 1880, and I read it while I was there in the landscape, and there was this one section that was so beautiful about how this main character is listening to these waterfalls, which is the sound of spring because all of the winter snow is melting. It's this thunderous, kind of brutal sound, and as he moves away from it, it begins to sound like a pipe organ. And so I took that text and traced every word using the first letter of the word to determine the color of the lines. And then the last section was I took this player piano roll of a piece of Grieg's music and used it as a stencil to generate this. And I like the idea that the scale of the film is completely related to the actual landscape and to the pages of the book and to the length of the music. And then the sound was composed using all of these field recordings that I found, although I have an old pump organ that I used in this piece related to the waterfalls. And then this is good, this is perfect closing. This is the map. And for the final piece for the show, I took this map and I translated the entire thing into English based on my Swedish knowledge, and created a map full of words based on the translation of the names of all of the places. And so it's sort of like comes full circle with where we started, I think. So, yeah, any questions?
What was the name of the writer?
Par Lagerkvist?
Oh, for that one as
No,
well.
what was his name? He wrote the lyrics to the Norwegian national anthem. I think it's Bjorn Stern Bjornson. There's two Bjorns in his name. The book's called Arnie, and it's a beautiful book. I mean, it's totally romantic and it's kind of typical late 1800s sort of tale of two peasants who are from different sides of the farm and find love. But it's the way he talks about landscape is really incredible. Yeah. Am I allowed to dismiss you?
For your paintings, do you figure out all of the imagery directly on the canvas?
Oh yeah,
Or
yeah.
Do you ever do preparatory?
No. And there's really, I mean, it's the same. I think, I mean, one thing that's interesting, because I work with sound in this way, that is, I just don't have a lot of compositional knowledge. I mean, I don't even know how to use Pro Tools very well. I still use it like a tape deck, essentially. And so there's no problem for me to work intuitively with sound because I don't have any other choices, essentially. But with the paintings, I've been building images for so long, that there is a way. And so for probably the first maybe 5 years out at grad school, I did a lot of drawings. And I didn't use them to make paintings, but they were very connected in how they were put together. And, there was this kind of approach to drawing that was faster and an approach to painting that was more about layering. But there was it was almost like a rehearsal, for the painting. And now it's, if I'm even thinking of something in my head, it screws it up. It's like, because I'm imposing my will on this thing, that when I do that, it just doesn't work. They look the way they are because it's a negotiation, and there are things that I'm not happy with necessarily, but I'm surprised by because they weren't things I was looking for in the painting. And those things then suggest other things. Whereas if I had something in mind, I would be unable to allow it to go wherever it wanted to go. I mean, I don't think about it in kind of new agey esoteric terms. It's just this very basic thing between me and the thing that I'm working on. And I move stuff around, I go sit down and look at it, and instead of going like, I really want to put something right here, I kind of let it tell me where it wants me to put something. And then that, if it works, then it totally shifts my whole perspective of the piece. And that is totally the same with sound, because the sound compositions are built improvisationally, where I'll lay down a repetitive thing or a single sound, and then I'll just respond to it. And sometimes it pulls it in the direction I wanted it to, and sometimes it takes it somewhere else, and I'll erase the first thing, and start to work with the second thing instead of trying to always work with the first. And the paintings, it's the same way. At some point I cover it up because it's just the thing I love is driving me crazy because I don't want to hurt it, and then I have to make it go away so that I have that freedom, or I give the painting that freedom essentially to allow anything to happen, I mean, it's like I always feel like the paintings are really quiet, and yet the amount of color in them is like you need sunglasses. And so it's about not forcing them to be to work a certain way, like how film works on you with music, the way music can seduce you to feel a certain way about an image that's not very interesting. And I feel like if I if I demanded certain things from the paintings in that way, they wouldn't look the way they look. You know, they'd be sort of mushy, brown, quiet paintings. But this way, there's the quietness is still inside them, but I haven't, you know, exploited it in a way that it wears it on its sleeve, and so you kind of get it so quickly. You have to find the quiet in them, which I think is a much more difficult process as a maker and as a viewer. But I think that's okay, you know. I mean, I think that's the same too with the sound work at times. I mean, it's relatively quiet, but it's never silent and it's never static. There's a kind of staticness to repetition, you know, but there's always things moving, and it feels quiet. And the volume level's soft, but it's the same kind of activity as there is in the paintings, you know, in a way. Someday I'll make a white painting and a silent piece of music, but I have to like evolve to that place, and I'm totally not there yet. Clearly, yeah.
This is kind of a clarification. So you showed us an image of the score, and you showed us a page of notes of a major.
Right.
And you've talked about that being helpful as a kind of directive.
Right.
You talked about intuition. So could you go back to maybe one painting that's that's related to a measure and talk about how you find form? I understand how you're finding color.
Sure.
But I'm really
Sure.
not understanding how you're
Sure.
finding form.
Sure. I think this is a good example because there are so many different ways. Here, I don't know how to make this bigger. So here, I know this sequence of lines is related somehow to the score, whereas maybe it's, I can't really see it so clear on my computer, but so it looks like it's 3, 3, 4, 3, 3, 3, 2. Right. So I'm guessing that's the 3s are C's, the D's are 4, the B's are 2. But there's also at least 3 or 4 different colors in there. So I could be totally wrong, and what it could be is B is pink, and C is brown, and D is yellow, and that sequence of colors generated that. So one of those two things generated this. If you look at this, I know for sure that I started at the beginning, probably on the inside, and built this. See how this color goes 1, 2, 3? Right. So that's a C. And then this one here is 2, so that's a B. And so this whole thing was built in that way. Each shade of green, and also the number of, like, these are definitely 2 A's right here.
Okay. But the form itself.
Well, I mean, it's you basically, the first thing goes down and the next thing follows it. It's like Legos or something. You take one and then you take another, and so here it's harder to see, but each one of these has a different number of bends or turns to it. Here there's like, I don't remember how many different things went into this. The first thing was this sort of part of the form, but then all these blues was another part of the form. And then the yellow was completely like, it was unresolved and didn't feel interesting, and I was like, well, I'll just paint that yellow. I mean, those things totally happen as well.
So they're not attached to the score?
No, what happened, I should have said this, is I was uncomfortable being able to say that everything in the painting was connected back to the score, because I felt like that was, again, a kind of, it's not human. It becomes art at that point, and it's about being able to back every decision up with the art part. And I wanted to mess that up a bit, because I don't like to ever feel like I'm making art. And so there has to be moments where, I mean, I'm spending so much time looking at this object where I just want to do something. And I can't deny myself that just so that I can back up the work better. You know, so the yellow part is something that happened, but it never could have happened without all of the other things that came before it. You know, so it's I don't ever want to feel like I'm forcing the paintings to conform to something, even the score. So it just seems, again, you know, there are a lot of artists that work that way that make great work, but for what I'm trying to do, which is to make things that, at least to me, feel vulnerable and kind of human in a way, these kinds of mistakes or decisions that are like unthinking decisions, you know, it's like jumping into a terrible relationship with your eyes open, but you jump into it anyways, you know. It's like, I know this isn't going to be something that I can justify, but I want to do it, so I'm going to do it. And they all have those areas, as well as, you know, areas where things are, I mean, this painting, most of everything you see is connected back to the score, but certainly not this brown area, which went on probably last, which saved the painting from being painted over one more time. This is the heaviest painting I think I've ever made because there's so many layers on it. I mean, resolve is such a difficult issue when you are working in this way, because again, I feel like it would be easier to just follow the score once and make these paintings that would be reflective of the score, but wouldn't for myself be as confusing as I'd like them to be, or surprising. So you can see here again, there's, I mean, all of this stuff back here is, you know, other iterations of the information, but in things that just didn't feel like I was stretching things enough. I mean, I love the luxury of having 5 or 6 of them around me while I'm working on one, because then I can look back at it and go, you know, this is totally familiar, you've already done this before, and then you sort of push it to another place, and they'll sit for a long time, because I think it's really important, if I don't feel like something's right, to spend a lot of time with it to make sure that it's not familiar that I'm looking for instead of rightness. And those are such different things. Yeah, shoot.
When in all these years that you've been exhibiting and different places you've been exhibiting, what you just mentioned about doing something, just putting in the yellow because you wanted to. I know when I'm working, there's times where I want to do something just out of the need of wanting to, but yet people always want you to have a specific reason. So I guess my question is, do you find that that's made it more difficult for people to understand your work, or in terms of them, I don't know, taking it academically?
Well, I don't, I mean, I don't like the word academic, but I don't know that understanding the work is the goal. I mean, what I'm interested in is creating an experience with painting that's purely visual, and with sound that is for the most part about listening, and with the films that is more related to time. And this is the difficulty of talking about my work, because the only way I can talk about it is to break it down to these sort of systems that I use to develop them. And I'm surprised no one's asked this question, because I get it every time, which is how much of this information is available when you come to see the work in a space. And I'm really ambivalent about that. I mean, I feel like that if the ideas are more interesting than the work, I'm in trouble. And if the ideas are necessary to have an experience with the work, I'm in trouble. You know, because I always tell students, if you want someone to tell you you're smart, you should have your mom come to your studio. You know, that's not really the goal. And so it's a difficult situation because, there are curators and people that I've worked with who, including my dealer, who grab onto these things, and 9 times out of 10 will use them as the kind of doorway into the work. And I kind of feel like they should be able to stand on their own. And sort of like I said about Jensen at the beginning, is I'm okay with people loving them for all the wrong reasons. They should be open. I'm not trying to make work that's directed, which is why I think the notion of understanding would be difficult, because I think they're situations for experience more than anything. And I think, on some level you could see that there's some methodical process that went on in their making, but I mean, with this body of work, I've never told anyone in connection to a exhibition space or the dealer or the curator what the piece of music was, because everyone would then try and see this work through the lens of the music. I've never listened to it. So, they're not pictures of sound. They're not visualizations of music. They use the score to generate this instead of 2 people playing piano, which, so it's an interesting dilemma. And I think, if you're a grad student, you're put in a situation where you have to back everything up that you're doing, which, I think life is much more complicated than that. And so is making paintings. And I think a lot of times it takes a long time to understand why you do something. And I think it should be okay for you to say you're not sure. I don't trust things that you can back up every single detail of, because then it seems like it was put together to validate an argument or a discussion more than letting it have its own inherent logic. But if you want to have a big art career, you better not follow my path and do stuff that can be reduced down to a soundbite. Yeah. Did you see that? No, go ahead.
I wanted to ask you something about the things that open up when you leave the frame, the rectangle, and the space, and what are sorts of negotiations open up? Because I've been fortunate to see an exhibition of yours at Tableau, and there was real dialogue between the sculpture and the sound too.
Right.
But there was a real dialogue between the sculptures and the paintings, and yet they both have their own. They made sense in their own different terms. So I was wondering.
Well, I do feel like my approach to different mediums is to try and be medium specific with them, so that I'm not trying to replicate my painting aesthetic or even the process in a sculptural form, but to kind of, painting's the sun. It's the thing that everything else kind of hovers around. So it's the thing that is a given. And so I'll look at sculpture and I'll think, okay, what could this offer me as an experience, as a maker, that painting doesn't offer me? Not what does the thing itself offer, but the process and how it evolves. Well, it evolves in space, and it's built from objects, And so naturally the sculptural work is even more connected to this idea of building, like building blocks. The building blocks are present and visible, whereas here they're kind of, but kind of not. There's no skin that tends to kind of go over them and change their form. They're more skeletal. And I think it's been only in the last 5 years. I've been out of school for 20 years, so maybe the last 5 years where I've felt that these things have started to come together in the way that you're talking about, where I could make a film and it doesn't feel so distant from what I do. Because at its root, I think everything comes from the same place. I mean, I do make work, or I have made work, that's not rooted in a translation system, but they're always about building blocks in a way. Not because that's what I love, but it just sort of, that's how I make, you know. So when I did the project with the scientists and this big tube, it was the first time I'd ever directed a piece as opposed to made a piece, where it was, carpenters and the scientists, and I was very uncomfortable with it because I didn't feel like my hands would transcend the fact that I wasn't using them. And it was a remarkable experience to walk into the space and feel like it totally was my work. And it was the first time I felt like probably everything I do from now on will sort of reek of me in some way. And it was strange. I mean, I walked around with the carpenters and were like, leave that nail bent, don't clean that. I like that crooked, don't fix it, and so I still had a role, but I did this thing, it's a long story, but I directed a recreation of Alan Capro's 18 Happenings in 6 parts earlier this year, which was an incredible opportunity and experience to participate in, and also the most uncomfortable thing I've ever done, because I had to be in charge of a group of people, and it was someone else's work, and it wasn't like, do you want to redo this as your work? It was like, it was total negotiation. How much of Alan was going to be present, and how much of me was going to be present, and how much of the other 7 performers would be present. And again, there were these moments where I was like, okay, if we leave this as it is, it's going to be totally disconnected from my work. There's one part where someone walks out and speaks like dirty jokes in a carnival voice with a megaphone. There's nothing farther than that from my work. But there were moments of quietness that I was able to really pull, And so it felt like I had these moments where the way I do things, the way I make things, it sort of bubbled out of the piece in a way, and then it sort of fell back in. And so I don't know. I think you make things a certain way for so long that it just starts to kind of happen, I guess. I mean, I also think I really drawing was not a part of my practice for a long time, because when I got to this point that I was talking about before, I just felt like they were simpler, faster paintings, and they didn't have any purpose, So I stopped drawing for almost 10 years, and I made a film. When I started making films, I made one, and then I didn't make another for 2.5 years. And so I think I've tended to really feel like if I step outside of painting or sound, because those 2 things I've done for so long, I should have a reason for it, I mean, I'm full of these sort of ridiculous kind of ethical responses to things that they're just like my own code that's absurdly rigid at times. And it's like, if you don't have a reason to make this in this form, like, why are you doing this, Because you want to see something on the floor instead of on the wall? And obviously that's just as good of a reason as any. But I got to push myself to do those things until maybe the last year or so. And whereas now I just sort of go into the studio and kind of roll with whatever I want to roll with. But it took a long time. I think that's why eventually I kind of allowed the sound pieces to become more visual, because it allowed them to be less elegant, and it allowed them to, I think, to have less sense of resolve, which is important I think as an experience to offer people, so they feel like there's room for them. So.
Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the role that a kind of fortuitous and example that's in the front of my mind is like your inability to read music, which allows you to approach it in a kind of completely eccentric and, also subjective way. Whereas if you were like trained as a musician or decided that you wanted to learn to read music, your relationship to it would be profoundly different.
Right. Well, I think there's two things. I think one is that I want to feel like I have permission to read things any way I want. But the other is kind of hand in hand with that is that the things that I work from generally are things that I have a very deep relationship with. And so I don't want to treat them with disrespect. I want to have a conversation with them that they might not necessarily be used to having, but to try to find something within them that is not necessarily what they were intended to give, but that could at least be as valuable as that other thing that they are intended to give. And the piece that I did with the colored green pencils with the Hesse text, I mean, I'd used that text probably 4 or 5 times before to generate work. I probably read it 50 times. And in doing these drawings the way that I did, it was like the slowest possible way I could read this text. And I found things in the text that I'd never seen before because I was reading it letter by letter. And I think at its core, it's not just about what the information generates, but how much depth can there be in terms of my relationship to the information. And not in a scholarly or academic way, of course, and not in a disrespectful way either, so that if I heard this piece of music, I wouldn't recognize it because even though I've spent 5 years reading the score, I did give a talk once and somebody instantly knew exactly what it was, which was pretty stunning. Not from my work, but from the piece of the score that I showed. But there are kind of, like now that there's 48 measures, and I think I've done 35 paintings maybe. And there are things that I've used them also to generate drawings and these other scores and sculpture. And so there are repetitions in the structure that I am now starting to recognize. I don't know what they mean other than like B, D, G, A, in a certain sequence. But it's a fine line. I mean, I don't want to kind of exploit these things for my own purposes, but I try to engage with them in a way that is just kind of different. And I mean, in a lot of ways, it's a pretty ass-backwards way of trying to make an abstract painting. It's served me well in the kind of awkwardness that comes out of that relationship, because there's no baggage. I mean, I think that's the difference. If I understood music completely, I'd have all this baggage, and I wouldn't be able to see it as a series of letters, and I wouldn't probably feel comfortable just twisting it into numbers and then twisting that into movements of my hand. And I mean, there are things that I've worked with, like texts, that I totally understand, but a lot of times it's things I don't, not that I don't necessarily understand, but things that were brought into the world to direct someone a certain way, and I want to let it direct me somewhere else. I mean, it's also about, the thing that the scientists didn't get that I thought was so amazing was that we're listening to this piece of music that's totally beautiful and gentle, and it sounds like rain on a aluminum roof or something, and he was all upset because it didn't sound like an earthquake. And I just thought it was totally magical that an earthquake could generate something so beautiful. And I like that a lot of the things I've used are not things that would be used to generate something beautiful. I mean, obviously a piece of music it was, but not in the form that it's taken. And I think it's quite interesting, and I think the difficulty of the relationship to go back and forth between the two is also quite interesting. because they're pretty much untranslatable by the time I get through with them. I mean, they're like, it's like they're like the haystacks, Yeah, now I think I should be able to dismiss you. Thank you very much.